The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet hallway of St. Alden's Memorial Hospital, its rhythmic sound echoing in Nurse Grace Harper's ears as she finished her final rounds. It was well past midnight, and most of the hospital had fallen into the eerie stillness that always seemed to settle in the dead of night. Only the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights, occasionally punctuated by the distant beep of a heart monitor, broke the silence. Grace was used to the late-night shifts. She preferred them, actually. Fewer people around, fewer interruptions. But tonight felt different. There was something unsettling in the air, a heaviness that pressed against her skin and made her acutely aware of every noise, every shadow. She rubbed her tired eyes and made her way down the narrow hallway, the soles of her shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum floor. The corridor was dimly lit, the bulbs overhead flickering faintly. She passed by a few rooms where patients slept soundly, their heavy breathing and soft murmurs carried through the thin walls. As she approached the nurse's station, a sharp clang echoed from somewhere down the hall. Grace stopped in her tracks, her pulse quickening. She glanced over her shoulder toward the source of the noise, a storage closet near the far end of the ward. A chill ran down her spine, but she forced herself to shake it off. "It's just the janitor," she told herself. "Maybe someone knocked over a cart or some equipment. Nothing to worry about." Still, she hesitated. Something about the sound seemed wrong, too deliberate, too sharp. Taking a deep breath, Grace made her way toward the storage room. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the shadows growing longer, darker the further she walked. The overhead lights flickered again, casting a harsh glare on the closed door of the storage room. Grace's hand shook slightly as she reached for the handle, her mind racing with all the stories she had heard over the years. There were always whispers among the staff about strange occurrences at St. Alden's, equipment turning on by itself, doors that opened and closed without warning, footsteps echoing in empty halls. And then there were the patients, people who claimed to have seen things, felt things that couldn't be explained. But Grace didn't believe in ghosts. She couldn't. She was too logical for that, too grounded. But as she stood in front of that door, every instinct in her body screamed for her to turn around and walk away. She ignored it. With a quick tug, she pulled the door open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the small room was dark and cold, the faint smell of disinfectant hanging in the air. Grace flicked on the light switch, and the fluorescent bulb buzzed to life, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the shelves of medical supplies. Everything seemed in place. Nothing looked disturbed. Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She was being ridiculous. Just another night, just another odd noise in an old building. But then, something shifted in the corner of her eye. A dark figure, barely perceptible, standing at the edge of her vision. Grace's heart skipped a beat as she turned sharply toward it, but there was nothing there. Just shelves of neatly stacked linens and boxes of bandages. Her pulse raced, but she forced herself to laugh, the sound strained and hollow in the empty room. "Get a grip, Grace," she muttered to herself, stepping backward toward the door. She flicked off the light and pulled the door shut behind her with a soft click. As she walked back toward the nurse's station, the feeling of being watched crept back over her. It was subtle at first, just a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, but it grew stronger with each step. Her eyes darted to the shadows around her, half expecting to see that dark figure again, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. And then she heard it. Footsteps. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable. They echoed faintly behind her, matching her pace exactly. Grace froze in place, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned around, her eyes scanning the empty corridor behind her. There was no one there. The sound stopped the moment she did. She waited, listening intently, her ears straining for any sign of movement. The hallway was utterly still. Maybe it was her imagination. Maybe she was just overtired, her mind playing tricks on her after too many long shifts and sleepless nights. But then the footsteps started again, closer this time. Grace's heart pounded in her chest as she took a shaky step forward. The footsteps followed. She quickened her pace, her shoes squeaking louder against the linoleum as she hurried down the hall. The footsteps quickened too, keeping time with her own. Grace broke into a near run, the sounds behind her growing faster, heavier, as if someone or something was chasing her. She reached the nurse's station and whipped around, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The hallway was empty. For several moments, she stood there, her chest rising and falling as she struggled to calm herself. She stared down the hall, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, any indication that someone had been there. But there was nothing. Just the flickering lights and the endless stretch of empty corridor. Grace pressed a hand to her chest, trying to slow her racing heart. She was being paranoid, she told herself. It was just the stress of the job. Just exhaustion. Nothing more. But as she sat down at the station to finish her notes, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her back. Something unseen, lurking just beyond her line of sight. The hospital seemed quieter now, the silence oppressive, almost suffocating. And though she tried to ignore it, Grace could still hear the faint echo of footsteps pacing just behind her, waiting for her to notice. The next night, Grace Harper clocked in at St. Alden's Memorial Hospital with a lingering sense of dread gnawing at her insides. She hadn't spoken about what had happened the night before. She wasn't even sure what had happened. All she knew was that the feeling of being watched had followed her home, creeping into her dreams, twisting them into grotesque nightmares. It was just exhaustion, she told herself, the stress of the night shift playing tricks on her tired mind. But no matter how many times she repeated that to herself, she couldn't shake the unease that clung to her like a shadow. Grace tried to focus as she reviewed her assignments for the night. Several routine checkups, 1 or 2 medication rounds, and a new patient in room 616. The moment her eyes landed on that number, she felt a sharp pang of anxiety in her chest. Room 616. She had never been assigned to it before, but everyone at St. Alden's had heard the stories. Lauren, a fellow nurse, caught Grace's gaze lingering on the chart. She offered a knowing, almost pitying smile as she leaned over the counter. "You got 616 tonight?" Lauren asked, her voice low as if discussing something forbidden. Grace nodded, trying to mask her apprehension. "Yeah, why?" Lauren's expression darkened. She lowered her voice further, leaning in conspiratorially. "That room's cursed," she whispered. "Everyone who goes in there comes out different. Weird things happen. I don't know if I believe in all that, but some of the older nurses swear by it. They say the room's got bad energy or it's haunted by something." Grace forced a laugh, though it came out weak and uncertain. "Haunted? Really?" "I'm just saying, be careful," Lauren said. "It's not just the patients who suffer in there. It gets into your head." Grace rolled her eyes but couldn't dismiss the cold, creeping sensation that climbed up her spine. "It's just a room, Lauren. There's no such thing as curses." Still, the unease gnawed at her as she made her way down the narrow hallway toward room 616. The hospital felt colder tonight and quieter. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her, casting harsh, intermittent glows over the sterile walls. Each step felt heavier, as if some invisible force was pushing against her, slowing her pace. When she reached the door to room 616, she hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the handle. She could feel a strange pressure emanating from the other side, as though the air inside the room was denser, thicker. She told herself it was nonsense, that her nerves were simply getting the better of her. With a deep breath, Grace pushed open the door. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the machines hooked up to the patient lying in the bed. A soft beeping echoed in the quiet space, the heart monitor pulsing steadily in time with the man's labored breathing. He was an older man, his skin pale and waxy, his eyes closed as he lay still beneath the crisp white sheets. According to his chart, he had been in a coma for weeks following a severe car accident. No family had visited. No one had come to see him. He was utterly alone. Grace stepped into the room, the cold air wrapping around her like icy fingers. She rubbed her arms, trying to shake off the chill as she approached the bed. The patient's face was gaunt, hollow, as if the life had been drained out of him long before he'd ever arrived at the hospital. His skin was ashen, his lips thin and cracked. But what unsettled Grace most were his eyes, closed but moving rapidly beneath the lids, as if he were caught in some endless, fitful dream. She checked his IV drip, adjusting it slightly. The machines continued their rhythmic beeping, nothing out of the ordinary. Just another patient in a long list of patients. There was nothing to be afraid of here. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. The mirror. It hung on the wall just across from the bed, a small, unassuming thing, framed in dull metal, reflecting the dim glow of the room's machinery. For a brief moment, as Grace glanced into it, she thought she saw something. A shadow, tall, looming behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. But the room was empty, just the steady beep of the heart monitor, the gentle rise and fall of the patient's chest. She was alone. Grace took a deep breath, trying to calm the sudden rush of fear that gripped her. She forced herself to turn back toward the bed, her eyes darting to the mirror once more. The shadow was gone. She had imagined it, surely, but as she stared at her reflection, her pulse quickened again. Something wasn't right. The patient's eyes were open, wide, glassy, and staring directly at her. His lips moved ever so slightly, curling into a small, sinister grin. Grace gasped, stumbling backward. Her back hit the door with a thud, and the clipboard she'd been holding clattered to the floor. The patient hadn't been awake in weeks. His chart said there was no brain activity, no signs of consciousness. But now his eyes followed her every movement, unblinking, gleaming with an unnatural light. "No," Grace whispered, shaking her head. This isn't possible." She scrambled for the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the handle. But before she could pull it open, the patient spoke. His voice was a hoarse whisper, dry and cracked, like the rustling of dead leaves in the wind. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Grace's blood ran cold. She froze, her hand still gripping the door handle. Slowly, she turned back to face him. His grin had widened, his eyes now filled with a malevolent gleam that sent a shiver down her spine. "What? What did you say?" Grace stammered, her voice barely audible. The man on the bed tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "You shouldn't be here," he repeated, his voice dripping with malice. Grace yanked the door open and bolted from the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing loudly in the empty corridor. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled back toward the nurse's station, her mind racing with what she had just seen, what she had just heard. When she reached the station, she collapsed into a chair, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She tried to catch her breath, tried to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the image of the patient's cold, lifeless eyes staring back at her, or the sound of his voice warning her away. Lauren approached, concern etched across her face. "Grace, are you okay?" she asked softly. Grace opened her mouth to speak, but found that no words would come. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes as she struggled to comprehend the impossible. She wanted to tell Lauren everything, that the patient in room 616 had woken up, that he had spoken to her. But deep down, she knew that no one would believe her. Not really. And yet the truth gnawed at her like a festering wound. Room 616 wasn't just a room. Something dark, something evil lingered there, waiting, watching. And now it had seen her. In the hours that followed, Grace tried to avoid that hallway, tried to focus on her other duties. But she could feel it, the cold weight of the patient's gaze, the shadow lurking just behind her. No matter where she went, she couldn't escape the oppressive feeling of dread that hung over her like a thick fog. And as the night wore on, one thought kept echoing through her mind, over and over again. I shouldn't be here. But deep down, Grace knew there was no escape from room 616. It had been 3 days since Grace Harper had stepped foot inside room 616, but the experience lingered like a dark cloud hanging over her every waking moment. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the patient's twisted grin, his cold, lifeless eyes locking onto hers. His voice echoed in her mind constantly, a soft whisper in the back of her thoughts, warning her that she shouldn't be here. She tried to rationalize it, tell herself it had been some strange episode of sleep deprivation or a momentary hallucination. But the harder she tried to push the memory away, the stronger it became. And the whispering, God, the whispering, was growing louder every day. At first, it was subtle. She would hear her name in the distance, as though someone were calling to her from far down the hall. She'd turn around, expecting to see Lauren or one of the other nurses, but there would be no one there. Then the whispers grew more persistent, following her as she made her rounds, threading through her thoughts like insidious tendrils of darkness. It wasn't just in her head. Grace was certain of that now. The walls themselves seemed to carry the voices, a soft, almost imperceptible murmur just beyond the range of comprehension. She could hear them at all hours, whispering, beckoning her closer to the shadows that gathered at the edges of her vision. On the 4th night, as Grace was checking the vitals of a patient in the ICU, she caught sight of a movement out of the corner of her eye. A figure, a tall, dark silhouette, stood at the end of the hallway, motionless, watching her. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. But when she turned to face it, the figure was gone. Her pulse quickened as she glanced around, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering slightly. She told herself it was just a trick of the light, that she was imagining things. But deep down, she knew better. Something was here, lurking in the hospital, hiding in the shadows, just out of sight. She finished her rounds quickly, her hands shaking as she made her way back to the nurse's station. The hospital felt different now, more oppressive, as if the very air was thickening around her. Each breath she took seemed to fill her lungs with something dark and heavy, and every footstep echoed with an unnatural resonance. "Grace," Lauren said softly, startling her as she reached the station. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Grace let out a nervous laugh, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm just tired. These late shifts are starting to get to me." Lauren didn't look convinced. She studied Grace's face for a long moment before nodding slightly. "You've been acting strange since you went into room 616. Are you sure nothing happened that night?" Grace hesitated, her throat tightening. She wanted to tell Lauren everything, that the patient had woken up, that he had spoken to her. But every time she tried to form the words, her mouth went dry. The whispers would start again, low and insistent, as if warning her to stay silent. "I'm fine," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just tired." But Lauren didn't let it go. "You know, I've heard stories about that room," she continued quietly, her eyes darting around to make sure no one else was listening. "I've never been in there myself, but some of the older nurses say it's haunted. That people who go in there hear things, see things that aren't really there." Grace forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I don't believe in ghosts," she said, her voice tight. Lauren nodded, though her expression remained grim. "Neither do I," she said softly, "but sometimes this place makes me wonder." As the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, filling Grace's ears with disjointed words and fractured sentences. She couldn't understand what they were saying, but they filled her with a sense of impending doom, like something terrible was lurking just beyond the walls, waiting to be unleashed. Around midnight, she passed an empty room and froze. For a moment, she thought she saw someone standing by the window, a tall, thin figure with its back to her, its head bent at an unnatural angle. Her breath caught in her throat and she blinked, expecting the figure to disappear like it always did. But this time, it didn't vanish. It turned. Grace's blood ran cold as the figure slowly rotated to face her, its features obscured by shadows. She couldn't make out its face, but she could feel its gaze burning into her, cold and malevolent. The figure seemed to stretch and warp as it moved, its form distorting in ways that made her stomach churn. And then it smiled. A smile too wide, too sharp, splitting its shadowy face from ear to ear. Grace stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest as she turned and bolted down the hallway. She didn't stop until she was back at the nurse's station, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she leaned against the counter for support. "Grace," Lauren's voice pulled her out of her panic. She looked up to see her colleague frowning at her, concern etched into her features. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost," Grace finished, her voice shaking. "I think I did." Lauren stared at her for a moment before stepping closer. "What did you see?" Grace shook her head, unable to put the horror of what she had just witnessed into words. She felt as if the walls were closing in on her, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. They seemed to be coming from everywhere now, swirling around her like a sinister wind. That night, as Grace made her way home, the whispers followed her. She could feel them clawing at the edges of her consciousness, digging into her thoughts like parasites. Her apartment, once a sanctuary from the madness of the hospital, felt cold and alien now. The shadows seemed to stretch longer here, the walls closing in on her as if the building itself was warping to contain the darkness that had followed her home. In bed, the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder in the silence, filling her ears with soft, frantic voices that whispered secrets she didn't want to hear. She pulled the covers over her head, squeezing her eyes shut, but the voices seeped into her mind, twisting her thoughts, pulling her deeper into the madness that had taken hold of her. "You shouldn't be here." Grace bolted upright, her heart pounding in her chest. She could have sworn she'd heard that voice. His voice, right beside her, as though the patient from room 616 had been lying in bed next to her, whispering into her ear. She jumped out of bed, her breaths ragged, her skin covered in a cold sweat. The shadows in her apartment seemed to shift and writhe, taking on strange shapes that made her stomach twist with fear. She couldn't stay here. Not like this. Without thinking, she grabbed her keys and rushed out of the apartment. The night air was cold against her skin as she hurried down the dark streets, her footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from the whispers, away from the darkness that was closing in around her. But as she walked, she realized something horrifying. The whispers weren't fading. If anything, they were getting louder. Grace stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. The hospital loomed ahead of her, its dark, imposing silhouette rising against the night sky. The lights in the windows flickered ominously, like dying stars on the verge of being swallowed by the darkness. She hadn't intended to come back here. She didn't want to be anywhere near this place. But somehow she had been drawn back, pulled toward it like a moth to a flame. And deep down, she knew why. Room 616 was waiting for her, and this time there would be no escape. The air in St. Alden's Memorial Hospital was thick with the weight of something unseen, something ancient that hung in the corridors like a veil of darkness. Grace Harper felt it as soon as she crossed the threshold of the hospital that night, the very walls seeming to pulse with a sinister energy. She had fought it for days, tried to distance herself from it, but now she knew there was no escaping what waited for her, no running from the inevitable. She was being pulled back to room 616. As Grace walked down the dimly lit hallways, her heart hammered in her chest, each step echoing unnervingly loud in the dead silence of the hospital. It was as if the building itself was watching her approach, a sentient thing that had long since lost its humanity. The whispers were louder tonight, swirling in her mind like a chaotic symphony, voices intertwining and pulling at her thoughts. They had followed her here, and there would be no peace until she returned to that cursed room. Grace reached the door to room 616 and paused. Her hand hovered over the handle, her fingers trembling. This was it. Whatever haunted this place, whatever had clawed its way into her life, it was waiting on the other side. She could feel it, a palpable presence pressing against the door, as if daring her to step inside. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself. She couldn't run anymore. Whatever waited for her in that room, she needed to face it. She needed answers. Slowly, she pushed the door open. The room was exactly as she remembered it, cold, dark, and oppressive. The heart monitor beeped steadily in the background, its rhythmic pulse the only sound in the otherwise suffocating silence. The man lay still in the bed, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling slowly with each labored breath. But this time there was something else in the room. A shadow, A tall, looming figure that seemed to emerge from the darkness itself stood by the foot of the bed. Its form was undefined, shifting, as if it were made of the very shadows that clung to the corners of the room. But its eyes were piercing, glowing faintly with a deep malevolence, locking onto Grace the moment she entered. A chill ran down her spine, her heart pounding wildly in her chest as the whispers intensified, filling her head with a cacophony of voices. They called to her, urging her to listen, to see. "You've come back," the patient rasped, his voice a low, guttural whisper that sent shivers through her. His eyes snapped open, glowing with the same unnatural light as the shadowed figure standing over him. "You were always meant to come back." Grace's mouth went dry. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. The shadow moved closer, its form twisting and writhing, as if barely contained within the boundaries of reality. The air around her grew colder, the oppressive weight of the room bearing down on her, making it hard to breathe. What do you want?" Grace finally managed to choke out, her voice trembling. The patient's lips curled into a grotesque smile. "You already know," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "You've known all along." Grace shook her head, her mind reeling. She didn't know. She couldn't possibly know, but the shadows pressed closer, suffocating her with their dark presence, and the voices in her head grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just random whispers anymore. They were clear, coherent, demanding that she remember. And then it hit her, like a floodgate had burst open in her mind, memories long buried resurfacing all at once. She had been here before. She had walked these halls, had worked these same night shifts, and had come to room 616. But it wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the second or third. She had been here over and over again, reliving the same events in a twisted cycle that had no end. And every time she had forgotten. Every time the darkness had taken her, wiped her memories clean, and made her start over, unaware of the nightmare that awaited her. "No," Grace whispered, stumbling backward. Her legs felt weak, as if they might give out beneath her. This can't be real." But it was real. She could feel it now, the weight of countless repetitions pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. She had been trapped here, in this place, for longer than she could remember. It wasn't just the hospital that was cursed. She was cursed, and the whispers. They had been trying to tell her all along. The shadowed figure drew closer, its malevolent gaze burning into her soul. "You belong to us now," it hissed, its voice a low growl that reverberated through the room. "You always have." Grace's heart pounded in her chest, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was frozen in place, rooted to the spot by the overwhelming presence of the darkness that surrounded her. The patient's eyes gleamed with twisted satisfaction as he watched her struggle, as if he were enjoying her torment. "Don't you see?" he whispered, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "This place, it's not just a hospital, it's a prison for souls like yours." "No," Grace screamed, finally finding her voice. She backed away, her eyes wild with fear and desperation. "I won't stay here. I won't be part of this." But deep down, she knew it was already too late. The darkness had claimed her long ago, and no matter how hard she fought, no matter how many times she tried to escape, she always ended up right back where she started, trapped in the endless cycle of horror that was room 616. The shadowed figure loomed over her now, its presence suffocating, its voice a low, rumbling whisper in her ear. "You cannot leave," it said softly, almost lovingly. "You are one of us now." Grace felt a cold hand grip her shoulder, and she gasped, jerking away in horror. But when she turned to look, there was no one there. Only the shadows, closing in around her, enveloping her in their dark embrace. She collapsed to the floor, her body trembling, her mind teetering on the edge of madness. The whispers were everywhere now, so loud that she couldn't think, couldn't breathe. They filled her head, clawed at her thoughts, pulling her deeper into the void. And then, through the chaos, she heard a voice, her own voice, distorted and twisted, echoing back at her from the walls of the room. "You've been here before, Grace," the voice whispered. "We all have." The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't the only one trapped in this nightmare. Every soul that had ever entered room 616 was still here, caught in the same endless cycle, doomed to repeat the same horrors over and over again. And now, she was one of them. As the darkness swallowed her whole, Grace felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The fear, the terror, the desperation. It all melted away, replaced by an eerie stillness. The whispers quieted and the shadows closed in, cradling her like a mother comforting a child. She had fought it for so long, but now she understood. There was no escape. St. Alden's wasn't just a hospital. It was a tomb, a place where souls were trapped, bound to repeat their suffering for eternity. And now, Grace was part of it. As she closed her eyes, she heard the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the door. Another nurse, another shift, another life waiting to be claimed. The cycle would continue, and Grace, like all the others, would be waiting forever.